Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 220 for the first of Tammuz in a leap year. So first of all, happy Rosh Chodesh. It is Rosh Chodesh today, so I hope you are having a nice one. It's the second day of Rosh Chodesh. And so today's episode is going to be really interesting. So today is kind of a continuation, really, of yesterday's episode. And the topic that we've been discussing and trying to grapple with is this idea of how when we talk about God, when we refer to God, when we reference God, especially in terms of his attributes, there's a tendency, which is very normal in humans, to refer to ourselves, to anthropomorphize God. And this isn't just something that we do like just on our own. We actually see that the Bible does this, that our prayers do this, that we see often there's references to God's attributes, God's kindness, God's wisdom, God's hand, even God's eyes. Like there's a lot of references to God that seem very human in a certain way. And anybody who's like slightly sophisticated, at least in their understanding, hopefully understands that it's not that simple, obviously, and that it's like God is not just like a bigger version of us. He's not just like a very, very, very holy rabbi, or something like that. God is something really, really different. And it's often explains that why is it that we refer to God in these anthropomorphic ways? It's really just to help us have some kind of understanding of him, some way that we can relate to him. We've also spoken about in Chassidus elsewhere in previous episodes about this idea that really the way to think about it is really to flip this whole thing around on its head, in the sense that like the tendency that humans have is to look at our hand, for example, and say, okay, well, I have a hand, so this is a hand, right? And then there's God, and we talk about God's hand. So when I think about God, it's like, okay, so God he might not have an actual hand, obviously, because we know that he's not human. So he has like something like a hand. So it's like, I kind of have a hand. I have an actual hand, and God has something sort of like a hand. But what Chassidus does, it flips this entire thing on its head. And it says that this hand that you think you have, that you're so sure that you have, don't be so sure about it. Because in fact, it's actually a very imperfect mirror image of God's hand. And God's hand is the ultimate hand. God is the concept of handness. And it's not only God has the ultimate hand, but God has the ultimate attribute of mercy, of judgment, of severity, of kindness, of wisdom, all these things. These words that we relate to in our own very anthropomorphic, self-referential way, they're all extremely imperfect when it comes to understanding what these words really mean. Like we're really limited to our own understanding of it. We gave the example yesterday of a child, that if you give a child a present, often they like the box better than the toy. So it's like they're limited in their understanding of value. They have this like very limited conception of the world, where they think that the cardboard box, which costs like 2 cents at the store, is more valuable than the present itself. They have no concept of the value of that present. So for us, it's even more so. It's vastly more different of like when we try to understand God's attributes, they're so vastly different than our own that we really can't even conceptualize them. So today's episode is really going to focus on specifically one attribute of God, which is, and one attribute within humans, which is where we left off yesterday, which was really the focus of the second half of yesterday, which is the attribute of Chochma, the attribute of wisdom, and really talking about it and coming to understand how when we think about the idea of wisdom and we think about how high wisdom is, that in yesterday we spoke about how wisdom is really the initial source. It's the highest of all the attributes within a person. For God, it's like it's not that high. It's not as high as we might think that it would be. So one thing that I think is really interesting, and something maybe to keep in mind as we study these concepts, and something that might lead to a certain level of frustration, which I know it does for me sometimes. So I'm kind of maybe sharing this with you guys, and maybe some of you could relate to this, is that a lot of Chabad Chassidus centers around this idea that we use our minds, and this is very intellectual stuff. If you've been following along, like there are a lot of technical details, a lot of ideas, a lot of concepts, a lot of philosophical, like it really, learning Chassidus stretches the mind in many ways, right? Like forwards and backwards and in all kinds of different ways. And we're trying so hard to understand what it is that we're learning. Like maybe you listen to these episodes a few times in order to really get the idea. I know when I learn these entries, these Tanya entries, sometimes I have to go over it 2 times, 3 times, a few times until I can really, really come to understand what it is that the Alter Rebbe is trying to teach us. But then paradoxically, it's like when you finally feel like you have a little bit of a grasp on what it is that we're learning here, the conclusion of what it is that we're learning is that we actually can't understand it, that it's actually something that's beyond our understanding. So it's this weird kind of paradox that we grapple with throughout Chassidus, is that we expand our minds to the point, and we utilize our minds to the point of their limits, of really trying to understand what it is that we're trying to understand, up until the point that we realize, oh, this is not something I can understand at all. This is way beyond my understanding. So it's a really kind of crazy journey that we're on here, where we're pushing our minds to the limits of trying to understand what is not knowable, what is not understandable. And this is really what the Rambam has instructed us to do when he says that there's a mitzvah the very first mitzvah that he gives us in his Hilchos Dea is to know God. And the explanation for that is that we really have this obligation to try to the best of our ability to try to understand and know God. And will we ever get there? No, we actually won't. But the mitzvah itself is to work on it, and is to try to get there. So that is sort of the mentality that I think might be useful in understanding what it is that we're going to be learning about today, namely specifically focusing on this attribute of Chochma and understanding what is Chochma exactly, and which we started talking about yesterday, and we're going to continue talking about today, and understanding how, well, for a human being, the attribute of Chochma is their highest faculty. Like it's the faculty from which all other of our faculties trickle down and receive their vitality from this place of wisdom, quote unquote, which is, again, an imperfect translation of the word Chochma. But then in terms of God, this level of Chochma is not that high. There's actually many levels that are way higher than Chochma. And for God, God's Chochma is actually the last step. It's actually the last rung on the ladder. And the parallel that we can think about it is when we think about the attribute of action for us, the attribute of maaseh, of doing things. This is like what Chochma is for God. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains this. Maybe he can break it down in a way that's a little bit more comprehensible than the way that I'm explaining it. So, okay, so now again, the Alter Rebbe is referring back. This is chapter 9 of Sha'ar HaYichud v'Emunah, and he references back to yesterday's episode, to chapter 8, where we talked about Chochma and about how Chochma is that initial stage within a person from which all the vitality flows throughout them, through their bina, their understanding, through their das, which then eventually leads to their emotions, which eventually then leads to thought, which eventually leads to speech, which eventually leads to action. Like there's a progressive chain of events that happens, which all begins with Chochma. However, when we talk about God, this same Chochma, which for creative beings is this highest of all levels, the beginning of everything, is actually the last level. It's actually the end point of his action, of his maaseh. Meaning to say that we can think of Chochma, God's Chochma, as being like what we think of as Asiya. So we see this actually where there's a quote here, a citation. This is from Tehillim, chapter 104, verse 24, where it says, Kulam bechochma asita. So, which literally means you made all of them with wisdom. So we see that there's this connection between doing and wisdom. So Chochma and Asiya, there's a connection there when it comes to God. So what does that mean? So now the Alter Rebbe is going to focus in on this attribute of Asiya within a person, or within any created being. So we say that we talked about how this attribute of action is like the lowest point in a person. So it's like when we go through that whole flow of Chochma to Bina to Das, blah, 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 all the way down, the final place is that level of action. So it's like if you see somebody just walking down the street or whatever, it's like it doesn't really reveal that much about the person. It's kind of like the lowest point of the vitality of the person is manifest within there, right? And when we compare that to a person's chochma, it's like a huge gap. Like it's like when you think about when you actually, if you were able to actually peek into a person's brain and see what their chochma is, that would give us like a much deeper sense of like, oh wow, this is who this person is. Like imagine going into like Albert Einstein's brain versus just watching him drink a cup of coffee or something, like kind of maybe compare it in that way. And so then going back to that level of the action, so let's say that action of drinking coffee or something, in comparison to the life force of the letters of speech, is that action of drinking is considered like nothing, right? So it's like we're going from below to above. So it's like the level of action is considered like nothing compared to the vitality that's in the level of speech, which is like nothing in comparison to the levels, to the vitality that's found in the levels of thought. So we spoke about all this yesterday also, like about how there's like a person's speech maybe reveals them and has a little bit more vitality in it than a person's just like pure actions. Like let's say you picture Albert Einstein drinking a cup of coffee. Let's go with that analogy. So it's like him drinking the coffee is like, okay, that it doesn't really tell us that much about him. It's like a very mundane kind of act that anybody could do. Then if you hear him actually like talking, I mean, I guess it depends what it is that he's talking about, but that might give us a little bit more of an insight into his vitality and like, oh, this person seems pretty smart, right? But if we were to actually go inside of his thoughts, then the thoughts, we see that those thoughts are actually the origin of his speech. And so his thoughts in comparison to what it is he's actually teaching us, it's like, oh, wow, his thoughts are all over the place. There's a lot more going on in his thoughts. But then when we compare his thoughts compared to the vitality that's in his attributes, in his personality, in his emotions, the thoughts actually lose their value. Then we see that actually the source of the vitality of the thoughts is coming from his attributes, from his emotional makeup. And then his emotional makeup we see is actually coming from a much deeper place. That's coming from his mind, from his intellectual faculties, his Chochma, Bina, and Das, which are the source of the midas, right? So then it's like we see that there was this huge progression from Albert Einstein drinking the cup of coffee all the way to his actual intellect. It's like you cannot compare the two. It's like this really big jump. And so the Alter Rebbe says this is exactly that type of jump that we're making from the action to the intellect in a person, is that same jump of God's wisdom, God's intellect, which is the beginning of the vitality of all the worlds in comparison to God himself. So think about that for a moment. I'll give you guys a minute to really meditate upon that idea. So it's like picture Albert Einstein drinking the cup of coffee. He's drinking that cup compared to Albert Einstein's brain, his genius brain. So now we're starting there in that brain. That's the source of everything, the source of vitality of all the worlds. But for God, that level of God's wisdom, which is the source through which he created all the worlds, is like nothing in comparison to who he really is. It's as if God is drinking the coffee cup. So it's like the way God's intellect is to him like drinking that coffee, if that makes sense. And not only that, it's actually, this comparison is true to many more degrees, to a myriad levels of degrees more than this comparison between in a person when we look at their wisdom and when we look at their action. And because in comparison to like, again, Albert Einstein drinking a cup of coffee versus Albert Einstein's wisdom, like, yes, there's a very big jump, but it's only by 5 degrees, right? There's the level of the action, there's a level of speech, that's 2, there's a level of thought, that's 3, then there's a level of his emotive attributes, 4, and then there's his actual intellect. So that's 5 degrees of separation. But when it comes to God is so far removed above the level of God's wisdom to myriads and myriads of degrees, to an infinite degree. So that's it for today. That's the end of the section. And so just to sum it up, is that like, it's when we talk about wisdom down here, when we talk about this idea of how wisdom is really the highest of everything, the highest, the origin of all of our vitality, we think of it, we put it on a very high pedestal, and we see how wisdom is very far removed from action, from the actual motion that a person is doing. But when we talk about God, and when we talk about God's wisdom, which is the source of the creation of all the worlds, that's actually the lowest level for God. And there's actually like so many levels above that to an infinite degree that we can't even imagine. So that when we think about action for us, like when we think about the motion of walking or drinking a cup of coffee or whatever, that's like the level at which God is operating when he's operating within his faculty of wisdom. So that, and to an infinite degree, because for us, there's only 5 degrees of separation, but for God, there's an infinite level of degrees of separation between who God really is versus God's wisdom. So that's it for today. And so I know these ideas can be kind of tricky to understand at first, but hopefully you are bearing with me and with the text. And so that's it for now. And we will continue along these lines tomorrow when we continue with chapter 9. And I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.